Hello, I'm Jensen, and I'm here for my con speech on mandatory music classes. Now, to begin, I personally have experience with these mandatory music classes. I was in band and choir until my freshman year of high school. And long before that, I was playing tenor saxophone, and I was, I'm pretty sure, also a tenor in choir. Now, I feel like this gives me some kind of authority to say that having these classes be mandatory is simply a chore and not worth the effort. Because I personally believe that forced music classes can negatively impact those who take it. Opinions on the music, or otherwise. Now, to start off, there is one big point that I think can negatively impact these music classes, which is time-poor teachers. I could personally say I have had a teacher who taught our music programs, who I would personally say, and also a lot of other people would probably say, was definitely overworked. Now, this might be a broad statement to hear from me, but this teacher did the music programs, obviously, which included the choir and band. But they also did our oral interp coach. She was our oral interp coach. She was also our director for the one-act play, our director for the spring play. She had to, mostly by herself, get ready all the concerts. And, this may or may not be true from what I remember, but I also heard that she was asked to also be a music teacher at one point. Or perhaps that was our current music teacher. But either way, my point still stands. Now, I can personally say that I feel like this is a lot of work and stress to be putting on one person's plate. And Dr. Alexander Crook published on May 23rd, 2017 on the article, "The Trouble Teaching Music in Our Schools," expands this by saying most teachers don't actually have much music experience, making teachers who can teach music quite rare, with that number declining. I can say that even if this number is quite low, that our music teacher was quite good at what she did. But because of that, it felt like she had all this pressure put on her and all these responsibilities placed upon her because she was the one who was most qualified to do them, especially as she had around 16 years of experience, roughly-ish, at that school. I at least know that she taught the senior class who graduated when she left from the time they were preschoolers. So that can say how long she was working. Which leads me to another publication, actually the same publication, by Dr. Alexander Crook, also published, of course, on May 23rd, 2017, in the article, "The Trouble with Teaching Music in Our Schools," where he says, on a similar note, those teachers who do music will often have to do more work, and even those who don't already have a lot on their plates to handle. Again, this is generally recapping what I said, and backing up that these teachers have so much work to do because of the experience. And overall, I can tell that for her, and not just the students, that these mandatory classes became stressful in a way. Now, on to my second point, which is music programs cost a lot of money. This was at the same time that music teacher was working, and this is a personal story. So, it may not be relatable to everyone, but one time, I think it was in junior high-ish, I had a friend who was also in band with me, and they played the trumpet. And one day, while we were setting up, they got out their trumpet, only to find it bruised and battered like someone had tried to put it through a wood chipper. This is clearly not a good thing. In the article by John McDaniel, Negatives of Music in Schools, if school spends the money too, who knows what'll get damaged? Items can be stolen or broken, losing money for the school. My story is a prime example of this. I can also say there was one kid who really shouldn't be trusted with any instrument. Kept getting his, I think it was a big bronze instrument, I can't remember exactly, but it kept getting damaged simply because he was working with it. And I feel like this is just, with how much these things can cost, I personally don't know. I've never bought an instrument myself, but all of these damages can be a lot to add up when a school might not be able to afford it. Published by thevault.musicarts.com on the article, The Most Common Arguments Against Music Education and How to Counter Them. Ignore that. Music, as it is a very popular genre, is quite expensive, and some schools already struggle to purchase the bare necessities. Like I said, our school, personally, doesn't have a lot of money. It is generally small, and our funding is not overly massive. And with these damages to these instruments, and with what all of this can charge the school, it overall ends up being a detriment to what our school can do. And even if one trumpet gets broken, or one big brass instrument gets broken as well, then these can be a huge impact for the school. Now, this brings me to my next point, which is personally why I think music classes in school shouldn't be mandatory, which is the lack of interest in students. Now, I'm not saying I lacked the interest in it. I will admit that the trumpet breaking story was quite entertaining at the time and quite funny, but other students may not want to be in music classes. And even for those who do, having them be mandatory can be more negative than positive. In the article published by John McDaniels on Negatives of Music in School, he says, even those who are interested in music classes are pushed to be very competitive, leading to bad feelings and negative outcomes. This is a generally broad one. Generally, that can be pretty negative, adding more stress onto the students, which already comes with having to learn and practice and train for all these things. And it just adds to the stress that I've already established that even the teachers can feel with all these classes happening. Now, published by Arbalduoff, I may have butchered that, I'm sorry, published on February 28th, 2015 on why students don't enroll in music classes, they established that only around 12% of students actually enroll, and this could just be because it doesn't interest them. Now, personally, I can say the choir and kind of band did interest me for a while, but I still have this decently strong opinion on them not being mandatory. And I think this is mainly because those people who aren't interested, aka those who are excluded from the 12% who actually enroll, if they were mandatory, these students would likely not care. And this can be negative because those who don't care can negatively impact the other experience for students. I can personally say I once had a concert where all the boys, which in our school is the main problem area, all the boys were supposed to have this small little solo. However, I can say I sang most of it. And in fact, I may have been the only one you have been able to hear. So I could say that with having these mandatory music classes, not only can it cause stress to the teachers, like I established, those who don't want to be there and just don't participate, but it can also negatively impact those who do want to participate. I know I'm not the only one at our school who personally feels like this. I am, in fact, probably have a less strong opinion on it than some of my friends and classmates who have left because of this reason. Now, I think music classes, personally, should not be non-required. even if it is just by having other choices for some kind of art credit, which is what our school personally have you need to have to graduate. Now, with the term art credit, it sounds like you wouldn't need just 2 music classes, but that's all our school has, which comes back to the point on the money, because our school personally doesn't have really the funding for either a music class an art class or an art teacher, which is why I brought up the point earlier of also our music teacher being suggested to be an art teacher as well. However, since our school doesn't have these options, it funnels everyone who both wants to be in the class and doesn't want to be in the class to all be together, which can oversaturate the classes themselves and make it just a more negative experience for those who actually try to enjoy it, like myself and others I personally know. Now, in conclusion, obviously, music classes have their upsides as well. I'm not saying they don't, but I don't think having them be mandatory and forced is quite worth it, a lot, based on my personal experience. Forced music classes can negatively impact those who take it. Opinions on music or otherwise.
Okay, I do have a few questions.
All right.
So going back to your very first point about overworked teachers, I understand that. My music teacher has also been asked to, and is being a science teacher. But you also have to think, music is her passion. Why not? What happens to those teachers who trained their whole careers to be a music teacher, not getting the option to be a music teacher because no one wants to have a music class?
I think this revolves back on the issue, which is slightly separate, but for a smaller school, which is like ourselves, obviously our music programs will not be that big. I know plenty of people who take the music credits because either they are genuinely interested in either the credits themselves or just interested in music. I know personally, I would probably be interested in a music class, even if just for the credits, if not for these things. Now, on a smaller school side, this may not be as applicable because less overall are going to be in it. But I can say that band, which not many people choose to participate in at my school, do end up being in band, even though most of the people who I've described who don't try do generally, those who go in band usually actually want to be in it. Because people who don't try don't want to bother learning an instrument. So I think this is a decent enough evidence to prove that there would still be that percentage that still wants to be in band. But having it be mandatory just can dampen the experience for everyone else who's affected by it being mandatory.
Going sort of with that question and the money aspect of it. I had a class last year where my band had 4 kids in it. Me and 3 others. You're wasting money on those 3 kids by it just being that instead of everyone in a grade. You'd rather spend the money you have set aside for music classes on everyone rather than 4 kids. Especially since if we hadn't this year joined with the middle schoolers, we would have had less than 3 kids almost. Obviously, we have a fairly big band now because we're with the middle schoolers, but at the same time, what about the money you're wasting when you're not having everyone in there, when it's not a required class?
That's a fair point. Having it not be required would mean that there's less people to buy instruments for, but if the school pre-buys them, I can see where that would be a waste of money. That is a good point, and I think generally I think that can be applicable to much smaller schools, which is a problem for ours, which may not be applicable to everyone. There are certain scenarios and different criteria where these certain things can all add up together to equal these generally no-win scenarios. And that generally seems like one. Our school, personally, has a decently sized band, even for just high school. So I guess I personally don't have that kind of insight into a situation like that. So you do make a solid point there. But I think the point on the damage it can cause still roughly stands. And perhaps schools could purchase these instruments with the different size of the classes in mind, although I could see how this would be a much more difficult process to do. So I think overall, you do have good points, and this would be a tough situation to navigate around, especially for smaller schools.
Okay. The competition aspect of it. My school doesn't have that kind, but I understand where a bigger school competing for, if anything, first chair or being one of the bigger instruments, the leading instruments. I understand that aspect of it. But at the same time, if we are talking about smaller schools, that still goes with, are we having a lot of competition? But also, the schools are encouraging competition within sports. Why wouldn't you do it in band? Because that also would help people get more, oh, I have to be better. Then they work at it. They don't ruin their instruments. They don't not have fun. They don't not participate. That's getting people somewhere, as well as, at the same time, just fixing a lot of your points.
Alright, I will admit that was one of my weaker points. And generally, competitiveness, while it can obviously cause stress, I've been in oral interp competitions before, you can get very nervous and very upset if you don't get something right, or if you don't get anything right. But at the same time, I do see your point. And a bit of healthy competitiveness is obviously still healthy. So I think it is a fine line between being competitive to a point where it's healthy and it's fun, and competitiveness to being stressful, which personally, in my time in band, I can say learning how to play the instrument can lead to be stressful. But, of course, this is my own personal reflection on how it went, and it's going to be different for everyone.
Okay. Also, with the required classes, you have required math classes, English classes, science classes. Why wouldn't you have a required music class? And also, a point to kind of bouncing off of it, if students had the choice, almost everyone would choose not to take math, English, or science, unless they were super interested in it, and that's what they're going to do later on. So why wouldn't the school boards use all of this stuff that I had talked about, or I will be talking about in my speech, the benefits that it has on students? Why wouldn't they use the benefits to have a required music class? They're using the benefits that you get in English and science and math to have enforcing it to be a required class. Why wouldn't you require a music class if it has benefits as well?
I would say something about generally math and English and all those classes being more generally applicable to your everyday life when you're older. Unless, obviously, you become a musician or, again, with a math class, you become a mathematician, an English major, something like that. I think you could definitely argue that music in general is less applicable. But I think you could definitely switch from having a mandatory music class, and I think you could generally, obviously there's going to be exceptions to this, but you could probably lump it into more hobbies or activities or extracurricular activities, stuff like that, in which case it would be focusing on stuff you like, aka more like an art curriculum or an art credit, which is what I usually suggest when I am complaining, or I'll just say complaining, complaining about how this system works. You can have these classes both for art, music, band, whatever you're interested in, instead of having only limited options, and instead of having to choose something you're not interested in, which generally might not be applicable to you later in life, instead you can have choices and choose which way you want to perform. Like how in college you can choose what major you would want to be.
Okay. And bouncing off the art credit. So you're kind of suggesting, rather than not exactly requiring an art class, but kind of bringing more light to them, is there any, like, studies or any actual evidence to prove that art classes do the same thing that music classes do?
I personally have not done too much research on the impacts or differences and similarities between music and art classes. I'm instead basing it on my personal experience, and I personally know quite a few people who would have rather had an art class than a music class, and to be frank, the choir probably would have been better without them. Not to say they were bad, but to say they didn't put as much effort in as they could have for something like an art class. I personally know people who have loved to draw, and have loved to paint, and have loved to do all that, who were stuck in music classes to do this thing they didn't care about when they could have been given the choice. I think personally that it's not about having a mandatory music class just be that. I think it's about broadening the choices and decisions a student can make. Although, no, I cannot say with a definitive fact that art classes are better than that.